Will Haley of Will Haley Video will be video recording our program today, and the file will be posted on the club website on Facebook and Twitter. Welcome to the 481st in our series of distinguished speakers. At the head table, I'd like to first recognize the new members in attendance. Please stand or wave. Richard Cassidy. Richard? Richard, good. Clay Ketchum. Clay? Hey, Clay, welcome. Donald Krantz. Donald's up here at the head table. And George Nadoja. Did I get that close? Are you here? Tell them I said it perfectly. We also have on my far left, your right, Kelly Olson. Kelly Olson is a graduate of the Florida State University with a double major in risk management and insurance and multinational business. Go Seminoles! Kelly worked for Star and Shield Group as the marketing coordinator for fire rescue and EMS before she became the third generation to join her family's business, Olson Insurance and Financial Services. So I think John's here as well as Scott. Scott? John here? Former chairman of the club. Without further ado, I'm going to present Jon Birger. Jon is an award-winning magazine writer, a contributor to Fortune magazine, author of DATE-ONOMICS, How Dating Became a Lopsided Numbers Game. Jon has written feature stories for Fortune magazine on Apple, Priceline, Royal Dutch Shell, and in 2013, he was named to Always On Network's list of power players in technology business media. Jon's work has also appeared in Barron's, Money Magazine, New York Magazine, Time Magazine, and the Washington Post. You just missed the talented Democrat. What's going on? What's wrong with you? He's a familiar face and voice on television and radio, having made guest appearances on ABC's Good Morning America, BBC World Service, CNBC, CNN, Fox News Service, MSNBC, and National Public Radio, discussing topics ranging from the dating market to stock market to the oil market. Jon is a graduate of Brown University, lives with his family in Larchmont, New York. Please have a warm welcome for Jon Birger. Jon?
Dominic, thank you so much for the kind introduction. I want to thank all the members of the Economic Club of Florida for inviting me here to speak today. I'm sure this weather is a little chillier than you normally experience here, but I was just in Boston and then in Providence, Rhode Island, where they got a foot of snow. So it's good to come down here and warm up a little bit before I head back to New York. My topic today, just in time for Valentine's Day, is America's curiously lopsided dating market. Now, we don't often think of dating as a market, but it very much is. My goal is to explain why dating seems so much tougher these days for college-educated women. Why is it we all know women in their late 20s, 30s, or 40s who are extremely marriageable, who have everything going for them, and yet they cannot seem to meet decent men? And why is it that dating seems so much easier for men, even those who have less going for them than their female peers? My own answer is not that these women are just plain terrible at dating. It's not because they're too wrapped up in their careers, and it's definitely not because of Tinder. Now, for me, the answer boils down to simple supply and demand, which I know is a topic near and dear to everyone in this room. So my plan is to talk for about 30 minutes, and then I'll answer questions after my prepared remarks. If I don't get to everyone's questions, I will hang around for a little while afterwards. They're also selling copies of my book, DATE-ONOMICS, in the back of the room, and I'm happy to sign copies, and I also promise that will be my last and only shameless plug for the book. But it is the perfect Valentine's Day gift for some reason. Finally, if anybody would like to get in touch with me after today, you can do so via my website, which is DATE-ONOMICS.com. So the first question I typically get is something like this. How the heck did a writer for Fortune magazine end up writing a book about dating? It's a really good question because normally I write about much more boring stuff like oil and gas or the stock market. I've also been happily married for 20 years, so it's not as if I have a lot of, at least very recent experience with dating. Even my friends were a little shocked when I told them what the book was going to be about. Well, here's the backstory. The staffs at both Money Magazine and Fortune Magazine, my last two employers, the staffs were both disproportionately women. I could not help but notice that most of the guys were married, like myself, or involved in long-term relationships, whereas the women, most of whom, frankly, had much more going for them dating-wise, most of them were single. And the ones who I was friends with, they seemed to have these dating stories, these dating histories, that to me, as a kind of old married guy, didn't really make much sense. They would go out on first dates and would never get called back. They had boyfriends who cheated on them unapologetically. Or, in the case of one of my friends from college, somebody who I describe, even to her face, as the most attractive person I'm friends with, she claimed not long before I began working on the book that she had not been asked out on a date in 6 months. The one thing all these women had in common were mothers and married friends and grandmothers who were chock full of well-intentioned advice about everything that they were doing wrong. Sound familiar? As I said, this didn't make any sense to me. The tipping point was a lunch I had with another friend of mine, Sarah. Sarah had been dating the same guy, Matt, for about 3 years. And while Sarah and I are definitely more work friends than personal friends, it certainly seemed like she and her boyfriend, Matt, were well on their way to getting married. So before our drinks arrived, I casually asked Sarah how things were going with Matt. Her expression basically crumbled. She told me they had just broken up. Matt had told her that he wasn't quite ready yet to settle down. Well, here's the thing. Matt is 45 years old. He and Sarah had been dating 3 years. She's 38 years old, or she was 38 years old at the time, and everybody knew that she wanted to get married and start having kids. So for Matt to basically run out her clock, to let the relationship drag on for 3 years without marrying her, well, it all seemed kind of cruel to me. Months later, I shared this story with a New York City matchmaker who told me she had heard some version of this story so many times, she had developed a moniker for the men. She calls them time thieves. So that basically was the inspiration for DATE-ONOMICS. I wanted to find out why dating was difficult for women like my friend Sarah, and so much easier for men, for their male peers. Now, going in, I must admit that my theory was different from where I ended up. Initially, I had assumed that the shortage of eligible men was a phenomenon unique to really cosmopolitan cities like New York or Miami or Toronto or Washington or LA. I called it, in my mind, it was the Sex and the City phenomenon. I figured there was something about the job markets in these cities that were attracting huge numbers of college-educated women. Well, it turned out I was wrong. The problem that I now call the man deficit is not just a big city problem. It's a nationwide one. According to the U.S. Census Bureau's American Community Survey, among college graduates aged 22 to 29 in the U.S., there are now 5.5 million college-educated women versus only 4.1 million college-educated men. I'm going to say it again. College grads aged 22 to 29 in the U.S., 5.5 million women versus 4.1 million men. That's 1/3 more women than men. That's 4 women for every 3 men. But I think what shocked me was that the dating math is actually worse in rural states than it is in big cities. Montana has 52% more of those women than the men. Arkansas, 49%. Florida, for whatever it's worth, is 37%. That compares to 20% more such women than men in California and 30% in New York State. Now, as daunting as this 4-to-3 ratio may be for young women now graduating from college, the reality is that it's worse over time. From a mathematics perspective, dating is a bit like the game musical chairs. I assume everybody in this room played musical chairs at least once as a child? Yes? Okay. If you ever played, you probably remember that in the first round of musical chairs, it's really hard not to get a chair. I mean, really, only the kid with his head in the clouds does not get a chair. By the last round, however, you have a 50% chance of losing the game. In other words, the longer you stay in the game, the greater your odds are of losing. In this way, dating is really similar to musical chairs. Imagine a dating pool that starts out with 40 women and 30 men, which is basically what college-educated millennials are facing today. Once half of those 40 women get married, 20 of the women get married to 20 of the men, the dating pool for the remaining singles becomes 20 women and 10 men. In other words, at the start of the game, there are 4 women for every 3 men. By the end, there are 2 women for every 1 man. That, in a nutshell, is why dating feels so much harder for women at 33 than it did at 23. Let's look at what happens when it's the men who are scarce, which is the situation today among college graduates. Sociologists and psychologists who study sex ratios have found that when sex ratios skew female, the whole dating culture becomes more sexualized. The good news, at least according to clinical sex surveys, is that when gender ratios skew female, everyone seems to have more sex and better sex. And yes, apparently this applies to married people too. That was supposed to be a laugh line.
It's the Bible Belt.
Yeah, sorry.
Bible Belt.
I'll pull that one out of the next, I'll move to the next speech. All right. The bad news for single women is that single men are in no rush to settle down. Marriage rates decline, divorce rates go up, and out-of-wedlock births become more commonplace. As I said before, one of my core arguments in DATE-ONOMICS is that today's hookup culture is largely a byproduct of these lopsided gender ratios. Not Tinder, not MTV, or any other popular explanation. I know last year's Vanity Fair story on Tinder generated a lot of buzz. For those of you who didn't read it, all you really need to know is the headline, which was Tinder and the Dawn of the Dating Apocalypse. In my opinion, Vanity Fair's story was incredibly naive. Tinder is less than 4 years old. The hookup culture was alive and well long before Tinder. In fact, there's really a rather long and totally ridiculous history of folks mistakenly blaming the latest for young people having more sex. In the 1920s, people blamed the automobile for the rise of the flapper generation and the rise in sexual permissiveness. A house of prostitution on wheels is how one state court judge described it. Well, the real explanation for the loosening of sexual mores in the 1920s had nothing to do with automobiles or with Henry Ford. Some 10 million young men had died during World War I. Another 20 million were injured, many of them grievously. This created an incredibly lopsided marriage market after World War I ended. Before I finish up, I have one more point related to college and gender ratios. This one is a little bit upsetting, but it's important, really important, if you have teenagers applying to college. Obviously, one of the hot-button topics on college campuses these days is sexual assault. While I do not blame the hookup culture directly for the sexual assault problem, I do believe there is an indirect connection that ties into gender ratios. The pioneering scholarly study on how gender ratios affect behavior is a book titled Too Many Women, and it was the brainchild of the late Marcia Gutentag, who was a psychology professor at Harvard University. Guttentag argued that women are more likely to be treated as sex objects when men are scarce. Another of Guttentag's findings in Too Many Women was that throughout history, when ratios of women to men were high, rape was more prevalent and it was also punished less severely. More recently, sociologists and criminologists have studied FBI crime data and Interpol crime data, and they've reached the exact same conclusion. In the words of University of Oregon's O'Brien, elevated rates of sexual assault, quote, are a predictable feature of countries with a relative scarcity of men. The opposite seems to be true of countries with a relative scarcity of women. Columbia University economics professor Lena Edlund investigated the impact of lopsided sex ratios in China, where young men now outnumber women by 22%. Edlund and her co-authors discovered that overall crime rates did go up in China as the gender ratio began to skew more and more male. And that's not really surprising given that men are more prone to criminality. However, there was one category of violent crime that declined precipitously as the gender ratio skewed more male. It was sexual assault. According to Edlund, it seems that men treat women better and protect them more when women are in short supply. Now, can I prove beyond all doubt that such findings in countries also apply to college campuses? That sexual assault is indeed less common at schools that are more male? No, I can't, because the crime data required of colleges by the Clery Act tends to reveal as much about how forthright colleges are in dealing with sexual assault and how comfortable women are in coming forward as it does about the actual frequency of crime on a particular campus. That said, I was really intrigued by a recent Washington Post story on this very topic. The article ranked 27 top colleges by their rates of sexual assault, and I could not help but notice which college was ranked as the safest. It was Caltech, a school that is 59% male. Thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.